Welcome to Gun Talk. My name is Dave. In this video, we'll be building an AR15 lower receiver. Please ensure when working on your firearm it's unloaded and in a safe condition. Please follow all safety protocols when working on your firearm. To install our trigger guard, obviously we need a trigger guard, 1/8 inch by 5/8 inch row pin, a set screw, some blue Loctite, some gun oil, some needle nose pliers, a starter roll pin punch, a 1/8 inch or number 4 roll pin punch, an Allen wrench, and a brass hammer. If you look at our trigger guard, you can see on the left hand side we have a bigger hole and it's smooth. That's where we're going to punch the roll pin punch into. On the right hand side it's a smaller hole and it's threaded. That's where we will insert the set screw and tighten it down with the blue Loctite. So what I'm going to do with these pliers, so these dog ears on our lower receiver, this aluminum's pretty thin and we don't want to bend it. So we're going to use these pliers to kind of stabilize those ears while we install the roll pin, primarily the roll pin. Alright, so to start I'm going to put our set screw in and tighten that down. I'm just going to use a little smidge of Loctite. Just a little drop. And getting it to come out. Whoops, I got a lot on there. Alright. Well, when I dropped it. Alright, now we will put our punch in. So I'm going to put a little gun oil on our roll pin just to help it go down a little smoother. And I'm going to use a roll pin starter punch. So now that the starter roll pin punch is bottomed out, we'll complete the job with a regular roll pin punch. See how that looks. Looks like we're pretty well centered in the middle. Alright, and that's all it takes to install our trigger guard. Now we're going to install the magazine catch assembly onto our AR15 lower receiver. Here's our parts. This is our magazine catch, our magazine spring, and the button, magazine button. I'm going to use this AR15 action block to mount our lower receiver onto to do the work. First thing I'm going to do is take my magazine catch. I'm going to insert it into this hole right there. Okay, I'm going to hold that in place with my finger. I spun our receiver around so you can see our magazine catch sticking out on this side. I'm going to take my spring and insert it. Then I'm going to take my button, insert it over that spring. I'm going to push it all the way through and hold it like this. So at this point, the catch is barely threaded into the button. I'm going to take a punch and I'm going to recess the button into the middle of the receiver. This way I can continue threading the catch. So when I get it to where I can't rotate it much further, I'm going to release it and see how far I've threaded the screw. So if you can see here, the screw is slightly exposed on the outside of the button, and that's about where we want it. Now we can do a function check on this. Zoom out a little bit. Take a magazine, we'll insert it. It's held in place. Now I'm going to depress the magazine release button and it slides out. So that's a pretty good function check. And that's how we install our magazine catch assembly. To install our bolt catch assembly onto our AR15 lower receiver, we'll need the following components. This is our bolt catch. This is a 3/32 by 1/2 inch roll pin, bolt catch plunger, and the bolt catch spring. We'll need the following tools. We'll need a number 3 roll pin starter punch, a number 3 regular roll pin punch, and our brass hammer. One thing you'll notice about these punches is they're rubber coated and they're about half the width, you can see here, of a regular punch, and I'll show you why that's important once we get started with the installation. I'm going to use an AR15 action block to mount our lower receiver to begin our work. First thing I'm going to do is take our spring and insert it into that hole. Next I'm going to take our plunger and set it with the rounded side toward us in the hole. Next we'll take our bolt catch itself and we'll set it there. Now that's spring loaded now, so to get started we'll have to hold that back while we drive the pin in. So here's our roll pin. We'll put a little gun oil on there to help it slide in a little easier. We'll take our roll pin starter punch, stick the roll pin in that. Now the reason these are coated and about half the width of a normal punch, it's so we don't mar up the finish on our lower receiver. If you don't have this type of punch, you can tape this up and use a regular punch and achieve the same thing. Actually, I'm going to take this bolt catch off to get this started, otherwise it's going to fall off anyway. Alright. Put our bolt catch back on. Now I'm going to take a regular roll punch and start hammering it through. Alright, that looks like we've got it centered up pretty well. Let's take a closer look here. Tell you what, I'm going to back it out just a little bit more. And that looks pretty well centered. So we push our button. Can't really see it that way. That looks pretty good. So that completes the installation of our bolt catch assembly. To install our pivot pin into our lower receiver, we'll need the following components: the pivot pin spring, the pivot pin detent. Tools we'll need are a number 3 or 3/32 roll pin punch, a pivot pin detent installation tool, optionally an X-Acto knife. In addition to our pivot pin, we also have a takedown pin. Together, these two pins connect the upper and lower receivers together. The pivot pin is the longer pin of the two. The head of it's a little fatter than the takedown pin, and it also has a hole right here, and the purpose of that hole aids in the installation and removal of the pin from the gun. The channel you see right there, this is where the detent will reside. This secures the pivot pin to the lower receiver. One of the first things I've done is added a little gun grease into the channel of that pivot pin. The reason we did that is that detent is going to be recessed into that channel, and this pivot pin is going to be sliding back and forth, so we need to lubricate that to reduce the friction. Next, this channel right here is where the pivot pin spring and the detent will reside. We'll insert the spring first and then the detent. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install my pivot pin spring into that channel. Now I'm going to install my pivot pin detent installation tool in. Now I'm going to take my detent and cover that hole up with one finger. I'm going to put that detent in there. I'm going to rotate it parallel to the floor. And now I'm going to line it up with that channel where the spring is. Now I'm going to take my number 3 punch and I'm going to recess that detent into that channel. And now I'm very slowly going to rotate my tool down, capturing that detent and the spring in that channel. Now comes the tricky part. So now I'm going to take my pivot pin with the channel facing the back. And now what I have to do is replace. I'm going to slowly push my pivot pin to the right. As I push it in, I'm going to replace where my detent tool resides. And the goal is to capture that detent into the channel. There we go. As an alternative to using our detent installation tool, we can use an X-Acto knife. So my spring's already installed. I'm going to take my detent and do the best I can to get it depressed into that channel. Okay, I've got it in there. Now I've taken the blade of my X-Acto knife and I've captured it there. Now again, with our pivot pin with the channel facing back, I'm going to install it into the hole here. And then I'm going to remove my blade, and it should capture into that channel. There we go. And that completes the installation of our pivot pin into our lower receiver. Now we're going to install a stock trigger into our AR lower receiver. These are the components of our trigger. This is our hammer, hammer spring, trigger, trigger spring, disconnector, disconnector spring, hammer, and trigger pins. And we'll also use a punch to assist with the installation. Let's get our springs connected to our trigger components. We'll start with the disconnector spring. This spring is going to go right here. And we need to push it down to make it recess into that hole. And it's going to, you might hear a slight click as it sits into that recess. Now our spring is wider on the one side than the other. It's kind of hard to tell in this video, but on this bottom side right here, the spring is wider, and that's the side that we're going to recess into the trigger. Push it in, and I'm going to take a punch. I'm just going to make sure it's down in there good. Punch is a little too big. Let me try a different one. Here we go. So now it's nice and snug in our trigger. Next we'll put our trigger spring on. Our orientation for this is going to be like that. Okay, and now we'll install our hammer spring. The orientation for our hammer spring is going to be like this. Alright. Now let's install our trigger components into our lower receiver. We'll start with the trigger here and the disconnect. The disconnect is going to sit like this over our trigger. So let's drop our trigger in. Now I'll drop my disconnect in over top of it. And now I'm going to take a punch, push it through from the other side to get things lined up. Now I'm going to take a trigger pin, put a little oil on it to help get us through that hole a little better. And I'm going to push this in, so I'm pushing things in from right to left. And you can see the various grooves. So So we get that better. See the various grooves on our pin? We want the long part going in first. It just takes a little wiggling and finagling here to get everything to line up. There we go. Now we'll install our hammer. So this is going to be the orientation of our spring. These legs are going to straddle over the trigger, and then we're going to push everything forward to get it lined up for the hammer pin. There we go. And again, the orientation of our hammer pin is going to be the long side in first. Drop a little oil on this pin as well to get it lubricated. Now we can cock our hammer, do a function check. Okay. Now our final function check will be after we put our safety selector in, and that way we can ensure that we can put the trigger on safe and everything functions correctly. And that completes the installation of a stock trigger into our AR15 lower receiver. The safety selector and the pistol grip will be installed at the same time. Here are the components. This is the safety selector spring, safety selector detent, pistol grip, and the pistol grip screw. The only tools we'll need to do this are an Allen wrench for the pistol grip and some blue Loctite for the pistol grip screw. To begin, we're going to need to cock our hammer, otherwise the safety select will not fit into the hole. So I've got our hammer cocked. Then I'm going to put a drop of Loctite, blue Loctite, on my pistol grip screw. I'm going to set that aside. Take my safety selector. I'm going to take a little gun oil and lubricate that. Alright, now I'm going to drop the safety selector into the lower receiver. Now we're going to take our safety selector detent. Notice it's pointed on one end and flat on the other. We're going to insert the pointed end into this hole right here. Now we're going to take our pistol grip. We've got a hole in our pistol grip. We're going to insert our safety selector spring into that. Now I'm going to rotate everything so so you can see better. I'm going to line the spring up with the same hole that I put the detent into, like that. Zoom out just a little bit here. Now I'm going to take my pistol grip screw, put it on my Allen wrench, and now we're going to tighten our grip down. And get this good and snug, because the last thing we want is for our pistol grip to come loose on us. Alright. Now our safety select is functioning correctly. Now let's function check our trigger. I'm going to pull the trigger on fire. It should release. Now I'm going to put it on safe. Pull the trigger. And done. So we've correctly installed our safety select, and that completes the installation of our safety select and our pistol grip. Now we're going to install our buffer tube assembly and our takedown pin assembly. The components include the buffer tube spring, the buffer retainer spring, castle nut, end plate, takedown pin spring, takedown pin detent. Tools we'll need to complete the assembly include a torque wrench, a castle nut wrench, and arrow shell grease to lubricate the castle nut itself. To prepare for our buffer tube assembly, we'll first install our castle nut. The tightening notches will be pointed toward the rear of the buffer tube. We'll want to thread this all the way back. And now we'll put our end plate on. The side that will be facing outward will also be pointed toward the back of the buffer tube. As you can see, we have a groove here and a notch here. We need to line those up and slide that back as far as it'll go. Before I attach the buffer tube assembly to the lower receiver, I'm going to apply some arrow shell 33 to the threads, and this will assist us in the future if we need to remove it. So now I'm going to thread it on. I'm going to give it about 5 good rotations. Now we have a hole right here. This hole is going to house our retainer pin spring and our buffer retainer. Now I'm going to use my thumb. I'm going to depress that retainer down, and I'm going to give our buffer tube one more rotation. Now the buffer tube is retaining the pin for us. Next, we're going to insert our takedown pin. So as you can see here, I've applied some gun grease into the channel of the takedown pin. When installing the takedown pin, I want this channel facing the back of the rifle. So let's go ahead and install that. Now, I'm going to give our buffer tube, we'll move it to about the 7 o'clock position. And we've got a hole right here. So this channel will house our takedown pin detent and our takedown pin spring. So next I'll insert the detent into that hole, and we'll follow that by the spring. Now, as carefully as I can without bending our spring, I'm going to depress that with my finger. I'm going to rotate our buffer tube back to the 6 o'clock position. I'm going to try to straighten that spring that's behind our plate here. And now that I've got it nice and straight, you can see our spring. It's being temporarily held by our back plate. I take my back plate and I'm going to start pushing it forward to capture that spring into this channel here. Now I'm going to hand tighten our castle nut. The spec for tightening down our castle nut is 38 to 42 pounds. With my 15-inch wrench and a 3-inch extension for my castle nut wrench, that's going to put me at about 32 pounds setting on the wrench itself. I'll have another video posted on doing torque wrench math. Alright, and now our last step will be to stake the castle nut down. To stake our castle nut, I'm going to use a Starrett 117C punch. And we've got these little divots on our castle nut. We've got about 3 of them. So what we're going to try to do is on the back plate, about 1/3 of the way back on the back plate is where I'm going to put the point of my punch. And I'm going to hammer straight down and push the material of the back plate into that little divot on the castle nut. If all goes well, we'll have a nice clean stake. You can see where I've pushed the material of the back plate into that little divot. Now they suggest you do 2 stakes. However, I don't have a good angle on the other 2 divots in my castle nut to do that, so I'm just going to leave it at 1. But with our torque setting and the 1 stake, we should be in good shape. Our final step on our buffer tube assembly is to install the spring and the buffer. Put the buffer in the spring, put the spring in the buffer tube, push it back, and the buffer is now held by our buffer retainer pin. And our last and final step is to install our buttstock onto our buffer tube. And that completes the installation of our buffer tube assembly and our takedown pin assembly into our lower receiver. This also completes the build of our AR15 lower receiver. If you found this video useful, Please leave your comments below and subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for watching.